Snotter was always the cheekiest of us engine spotters, and the first to get into any mischief that was going. He once got me locked into an empty luggage van, and I was dead lucky not to end up at Hunstanton. Another time he pushed my brother Eric into the pond which fed the water tower, and after that we weren't allowed out to go spotting for all of a month. We certainly knew our way about in those days, although the loco staff turned a pretty tolerant eye on us. We had to be a bit crafty with the station master and the inspectors. We hated buying platform tickets, mainly because we rarely had the penny spare to pay for them, and so had to sneak onto the station to get to the best vantage points. From the end of platform 2, we could see right down to the sheds, and it was also good for spotting the through trains. Furthermore, it was so far from the station buildings that the inspectors seldom bothered to chase us off once we had reached it. There we stood, in all weathers, our notebooks and spotters' guides at the ready, waiting for a cop, a rare visitor to our shed, perhaps of a class we had never seen before. Many of the engine crews befriended us, sometimes allowing us onto the footplate for a moment or two. If we went down to the shed, they might be persuaded to show us around, though more often we got seen off by the locomotive superintendent and his staff. Looking back, you can see his point, for it was a dark and dangerous place for young boys to be let loose in, and accidents were fairly frequent there, even among enginemen who were supposed to know their way about. To Snotter, the spotter, of course, to be banned from a place was a challenge. He was always hovering on the approaches to the sheds, plotting ways to get in, but ready to flee from the wrath of the staff who were there, by now heartily sick of his cheek and mischief. It was many years later that I learned the full story of poor Snotter's downfall, from an old engine driver who was a permanent fixture in my local pub. Apparently, the younger members of the staff at the shed decided to teach Snotter a lesson. They lured him into the yard, caught him, soaked him with water from a hose on one of the loco's tenders, and then rolled him in the ash pit. He got into terrible trouble from his parents for this, and wasn't allowed out for ages. He swore vengeance against those who had treated him such a rough and treacherous manner. Snotter could be vicious against his enemies. Small things began to go wrong at the shed. Fire irons disappeared, to be found many months later in the most unlikely of places. One set of irons so successfully jammed the turntable that he was out of action for 2 days. Fog detonators let off immediately outside the convenience when someone was in residence did not improve the peace of mind of the staff either. Snotter crept around the shed doing as much mischief as he could. Occasionally he was seen and was once hit by a large lump of coal thrown from the footplate, but he took care not to be caught again. Spurred on by these successes, his pranks became more spectacular and dangerous. He discovered how to put an engine in gear and how to keep its regulator open. Cleaners would light the fire in the firebox of a cold engine, and then it would be left for a time to look after itself. If, however, a gremlin happened to meddle with the controls at this time, the results could be catastrophic. On 2 occasions, engines moved off into the yard of their own accord as their fires burned up and the steam pressure increased to a working level. first incident, the engine crashed into a number of empty coal wagons by a coaling stage, doing a considerable amount of damage. The second time, the loco would have run onto the main line had catch points not derailed it first. After this, the police were alerted, and though there was nothing to prove that Snotter had a hand in the accidents, his parents were told of the dire consequences that could come of his meddling, and so kept a very tight rein on him indeed. Whether Snotter did, in fact, have anything to do with the third accident will never be known. About 6 months after the derailment of the runaway engine, another runaway caused the death of a favourite driver, Sam Larkins. Sam had his B-17 Rabbi Castle over the inspection pit at the time and had climbed up among the gears to do the oiling. A Super Claude suddenly began to roll down the engine, roll down the same track, and hit the B-17. Poor old Sam was so caught up with his loco's innards that it took the fire brigade 2 hours to cut him out, by which time he was dead. And again, nothing could be proved against Snotter, but neither did anyone believe that he had not done it, and in the end his parents moved away from the place. There the story would have ended, had the railway not been so strongly in Snotter's blood. When he left school 3 years later, he applied for a job as an apprentice engine cleaner in the town where his family then lived. This place was also served by the London North Eastern Railway, but was far enough away for his exploits not to be known there. Years passed. The railways were nationalised, and Snotter became a fireman, at first confined to shunting duties about his home yard, but eventually he was promoted and became a fireman on the main line. The day previous to his death, Snotter had worked a special from his home shed in the north to the town of his birth. The return working was to be the next day, a Sunday, and after sleeping at the hostel, he had risen early to tend his engine in the shed. He didn't trust the local cleaners to raise steam, as he knew them to be unfamiliar with his class of loco. In any case, the shift did not begin until 4:30 a.m., and Snotter knew an earlier start had to be made if the engine was to be ready to leave with his train at 6:45. So the shed was deserted when he got there, its atmosphere as murky as he remembered, the uncanny noises of water gurgling and metal contracting startling him from time to time as boilers and fireboxes cooled down. Carefully, Snotter built his fire. Soon there was enough pressure in the boiler to take the locomotive onto the turntable for turning. This was a delicate job that a fireman always enjoyed, for the centre of balance had to be exact to within half an inch if the table was to turn easily, and loaded with more than 160 tons of train. At last, Snotter was satisfied that he had his beast exactly right, and screwed down the brake. He climbed from the cab and made his way to the push bar, knowing that it was going to be a struggle to turn it single-handed. The motor that used to turn it using the loco's own steam pressure had long been out of order. By using all his strength, he managed to get the thing moving. Then it was easy. He began to get concerned about how he was going to stop it at the right set of tracks without damaging the ratchet. Accordingly, he dodged to the other side of the push bar, put his back against it, and dug in his heels to slow the great weight down. As he did so he saw, with horror, the engine on his left begin to move forward. He had 3 seconds to see that it was going to be in his path, and used half of this time desperately putting more of his strength against against the unstoppable weight pushing him forward. In his last moments he had time to realize that there was no escaping an awful death, which at least had the merit of being swift and distinctive. The bar broke his back before slamming into the side of the runaway and breaking off. The turntable continued to revolve for many minutes unattended, and was still moving slowly when the cleaners arrived some minutes later. The official inquiry could find no explanation for the movement of the loco which fouled the turntable. Its fire was unlit, and it was sworn that the wheels had been chocked. Only the older hands at the shed thought of an answer to the mystery when they found out the unfortunate victim had been Snotter. The Jinxed Jubilee. Steve Banyard went to a lot of trouble to make his visit to the remote scrapyard siding, and he was uncertain of his motives in making the trip. Had he gone to gloat over a corpse in decay, or was there something in him that could not bear the thought of a lynx disappearing from the face of the earth without him paying her his last respects? He had recognized her at once among the crowd of derelicts in similar condition. His nameplate had gone, but the number was still on the cab, 45743. Below it, in a crudely painted letter, C, standing for condemned. Even in this shabby state, the engine remained distinctive. For Steve, she had an aura of sinister fascination that was unique. Nor would he have been unduly surprised to see her suddenly come to life and steam off down the rusty tracks towards the main line. Steve had been at great pains to learn every detail of her history. He had found that from the first she had been unlucky. In the mid-1930s, while under construction at Crew Works, a crane had dropped a large piece of superstructure, killing a foreman. Soon after, while still being run in, she had hit a cart on a farm crossing. Again, the accident had been fatal, this time to a farmhand. A little later, she was successful in helping 2 suicide attempts succeed, separate occasions these, to the famous double suicide she aided much later when her bogey wheels put an end to her early sufferings of a celebrated actor-manager and his boyfriend. There had been a couple of further incidents during the war. At the height of the raids on Coventry, Lynx found herself at the station there. The fireman made off for the air raid shelter, but the driver decided to stay with the train, taking refuge beneath the engine. A landmine exploded about 50 feet away, and though Lynx suffered little damage, being screened by another train, so great was the blast at ground level that the driver's lungs were burst and he died almost instantly. By the time the crews were becoming wary of the locomotive, they rechristened her Jinks after this last incident, and attributed every little misfortune to the curse that they believed had been laid on her. However, the worst was yet to come, though in this next accident she was not to suffer harm herself. The mishap occurred in the final months of the war, when 6 years of hard use and a somewhat neglected maintenance program had contributed to make much of the motive power available unreliable, to say the least. Lynx's right-hand coupling rod came adrift when she was at the head of her 50 refrigerated meat vans, descending a 1 in 100 gradient. Of course, the crew off steam and applied the brakes once they felt the uneven running and saw ballast flying past the window of the cab. But by then the damage had been done. The sleepers of a half-mile of track had been disturbed, and from the opposite direction the Hensham to Euston boat train was approaching. Fortunately, the gradient meant that this was labouring at about 40 miles an hour, but its engine became derailed as it passed links and turned over as it ploughed into the meat vans. The leading coaches telescoped, and within half a minute a terrible scene had been created. Human and animal carcasses intermingled. 20 died in the accident, and 50 or so more were seriously hurt. Nationalisation saw Lynx in new livery, but her troubles continued, albeit not to such a bloodthirsty degree as before. She now seemed to enjoy making life hell for those who had to work with her. If she was derailed, then you could be sure that it would be at the throat of a busy station. She once succeeded in closing down Euston altogether during the rush hour. If she was going to run out of steam, then you could bet that it would be in the middle of an unventilated tunnel. Driver and fireman would have to crouch on the floor of the cab or drop to the tracks to breathe deep lungfuls of relatively clean air while the fire burned up. All the crews at the shed were anxious to avoid working her, with the exception of Steve Banyard, who, for some reason he failed to understand, enjoyed her perversity and was determined to tame her. Later he would boast that his success was due to his treating her like he would a woman, with just the right amount of indifference mixed with the extra care at difficult times. Anyway, his treatment proved successful, and Lynx seldom got herself into trouble. Whereas before it had been difficult to persuade firemen to work her, they began to forget their prejudices, and since Steve was a good driver and companion, volunteered for duties with her. Steve knew that the engine was still capable of throwing tantrums, but he felt himself to be in control of her and prided himself on this. By now, the days of steam were drawing to an end, and like most enginemen of the time, Steve resented the coming of the diesels, but had to resign himself to working with them. His last trip with Lynx was a sad one, and he felt a strong surge of affection as he left her for the last time, in a siding by the ash pits. Her last steam hissed gently from the leaky joints, her last smoke drifted peacefully up to the dusky sky, and Steve thought he would never see her in steam again. Mistaken in thinking this. Shortly after his sad visit to the scrapyard, he read that Lynx had been bought by the Cwm Avon Steam Trust, a preservation society situated in the valleys of South Wales. They intended to restore her to her former glory immediately, and hoped to have the work done in time to have her in steam for the start of the summer season. However, this forecast proved to be over-optimistic, and when Steve travelled to Cwm late that summer, he found her still in the workshops in small pieces. Members of the society that he spoke to were fascinated to learn that he had been the engine driver's last driver, and eagerly questioned him about her characteristics in steam. But Steve refrained from telling them the less savoury details of her history, and left for home feeling flattered by the attention he had received. Lynx took to the rails again the summer following. Her inaugural run was a fete day ceremonies he would have attended, but he was able to view brief moments on TV. The Minister of State for Welsh Affairs cut the ribbon in front of Lynx's buffers, and it would not have been in character for her to have promptly run him over to share the fate of the unfortunate Mr. Huskinson at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. This was not to be, however. Instead, there was a dramatic pause while the crowds waited for Lynx to draw majestically forwards. But nothing happened until the red-faced driver emerged from his cab to announce that nothing he could do would get the brake off. For the rest of the afternoon, the recalcitrant engine stood immobile at the platform as an army of amateur mechanics attempted to dismantle the mechanism. In the end, her fire had to be dropped where she stood, and there she remained until the weekend following, when a mechanic familiar with the class was brought to Cumhaven and eventually put her right. Lynx's reluctance to begin a new career did not end with this incident. She never steamed properly, even for the 3.5-mile run to Pontefago Dock. She particularly resented having to make the return journey tender first. Having run round her train, she would approach it again forwards. Coupling up this way proved a nightmare for her driver. Suddenly the controls seemed to be ridiculously sensitive. Beckoned onwards by his fireman, he would inch closer and closer to his coaches. Yet, however delicately he did this, the locomotive would suddenly surge forwards at the last, so that there would be an unholy crash of buffers and often bumps and bruises for the passengers. Yet, no one could blame Lynx for the final disaster. Amateur engineers can be remarkably clever in getting results after bypassing regular procedures. They may, however, occasionally engage in irresponsible enterprises which can prove extremely dangerous. A group of these gifted amateurs decided to improve her steaming by modifying the blast pipe. When the alterations were complete, it was decided that she should be tried out on the following Sunday, the very day that Steve had elected to visit her again at Cumhaven. A fire had been kindled and had got going nicely when the group of would-be Stevensons took themselves off to the pub, confident that there would be a good working pressure on the gauge when they returned. Steve turned up at about 2:30 to find the place deserted. He let himself into the old engine shed, which was the Trust's headquarters. There he found Lynx, steam hissing viciously out of every pipe and crevice. He climbed up to the footplate and glanced at the dial. The needle was jammed up against the stop, well over 350 pounds per square inch. Desperately, he reached for the knobs to release some of the pressure, turned them, but there was no effect. At that moment, the boiler exploded. The force of the explosion de-roofed the engine shed and destroyed most of the rolling stock standing nearby. It also decimated the executive members of the Trust, who had just at that moment returned from the pub. Steve's body had been hurled back against the bulkhead of the tender, and, already lifeless, it was then disintegrated by the force and heat of the escaping steam. The black curse laid on Lynx from the time of her building had at last been dispelled by her own destruction. Thank you for listening. This is the man in the corner seat.